Well, good morning. I've been asked to share some thoughts with you about the future of education. It's my belief that we are entering a brand new era. We're sort of in the middle of this transition into a new era where the rules of society aren't written in law books, but they'll increasingly be encoded in software. They'll be written in software. I call it a software-defined society. And what's remarkable about this transformation is that it's largely invisible to us. We can't see it. We talk about it. We read about it in the press. We hear about it in media. But we very often cannot see it. Unless you're based in Silicon Valley, where they're testing robot vehicles and there are 10,000 startup companies, you often don't see signs of disruptive transformation. In fact, in many parts of the country, the only sign that you'll see of this big transformation is a sign in the front of a window that says, going out of business. Since the beginning of this year, just in the first few months of this year, 9 major retail chains have closed their doors. 85,000 jobs have been lost. The retail industry is going through a dramatic transformation right now. It's the most visible sign of this transformation, I believe. And every time a store closes its doors, a familiar store, like in this example, Blockbuster, every time a store like that goes out of business, it reminds us that we've given up a habit that we used to have. For instance, we no longer rent DVDs or Blu-ray discs. And there are many other habits we've shed. We don't buy CDs anymore. We don't use payphones. We don't use telephone books. We don't use fax machines. We don't visit travel agents. And so we're kind of shedding habits as we go through this transformation, but we're often unconscious about that process because we're always moving on to the next thing. Now, some people call this process dematerialization, dematerialization into software, dematerialization into pure information. I have a different term for it. The term I use is vaporized. I think it's a better term, frankly. It's a cooler idea. The idea is simple. It's, something is there and then it's gone in a puff of smoke. It literally disappears in front of our very eyes. Now you see it, now you don't. That might seem a little bit odd when I say it that way, but actually every single time you use your smartphone, you're vaporizing something that's very familiar to you. And if you don't believe me, just consider these examples. Amazon now sells more ebooks than hardbound and paperback books combined. Books have been vaporized. The music industry has gone through this process as well. The streaming music services now comprise more revenue for the music industry than all other forms of revenue combined. The map business has gone through a tremendous transformation. Do you remember maps? It wasn't that long ago that you would have to buy a map. And think about that as a business model. $15 for a very beautifully printed piece of paper. Nice racket if you can do it, but now that business is long gone. Every phone that we buy comes with a much better map that tells you where you are in the language of your choice. The games industry has been transformed. As Megan pointed out, I was part of the group that brought mobile games to the United States in early 2001. And at that time, people thought we were crazy. The game industry thought it was quite a mad idea to try to put games on smartphones. Today, the idea of downloading a game to a phone is no longer novel. It's the largest source of revenue in the game industry. It's not just a new distribution technique for games. It's also transformed the way we design games. It's got a completely different business model. And so this distribution technology has actually reshaped the entire industry. By the end of this decade, mobile games will comprise half the revenue in the game industry. And my friends in TV never like it when I say this, but it's true that television's being vaporized right now. More than half the households in the United States subscribe to a streaming media service of some sort like Netflix. But it's not just an American phenomenon. You see, we're not just vaporizing the DVD or the videotape, of course. Of course, we've already done that. When you launch a streaming video service, you're actually vaporizing the infrastructure of television as well. And in the old days, if you wanted to be in the TV business, you had to buy a TV station with a giant tower and spectrum, or you had to put a satellite up in space. But today, you can launch a streaming media service in a few days. And that's why around the world, there are thousands of VOD, video-on-demand streaming video services being launched. This is a global phenomenon. So when I use that term vaporized, what I mean is that we're replacing physical stuff with software. Invisible software that can be downloaded anytime and any place. And if you think it's limited to media, maps, and music, well, you're mistaken. It's not limited to that. We're actually replacing hardware. Your mobile phone in the past decade has taken on the attributes or absorbed the functionality of more than 24 consumer electronics devices. And the companies that make those consumer electronics devices have experienced double-digit decreases in their sales over the past decade. So the companies that make GPS units, digital cameras, MP3 players, and so forth, they've experienced tremendous losses. in their businesses as the mobile phone has absorbed the functionality of those devices. So my belief, my theory is that whatever can be vaporized will be. Whatever can be replaced by software will be. Whatever can be turned into an invisible service delivered over the air, that will happen. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably going, wait a minute. We're not going to vaporize clothes. We're not going to vaporize food. We're not going to vaporize our apartments, our houses. Of course not. But the way we get those things is going to change. And the evidence of that, of course, is in retail. And we see a tremendous wave of transformation striking retail. It's not just that stores are closing. Retailers are also rapidly trying to reinvent the store by bringing digital technology into the store. And you've experienced this yourself, where you've seen, the mirrors and displays now have become interactive digital displays and so forth. You're starting to see digital technology introduced to the store. But perhaps the most disruptive technology hitting the retail business is this little tiny thing, this square reader, because that means that we no longer need a store. Anybody can be a merchant, any place. So when you go to a flea market or a farmer's market or something, you see people are swiping credit cards. So everyone who wants to be a merchant can have that store, that cash register in their pocket. And this brings us to the concept of annihilating time and space. Now, this phrase has been used in connection with every new technology that's been introduced in transportation and telecommunications for the past 200 years. The railroad industry is where they first used it. So the railroads that shaped Nebraska, for instance, in your history here in the state, they used to use the term annihilating time and space when they described how the railroad was shrinking distance, making it possible for people to travel quickly. And they used that phrase again when they introduced the telegraph and the telephone and so forth. But I think now with the mobile phone, you can really say we are annihilating time and space. And I think there are very important implications for the future of education when we think about that. Placeless education is a possibility. Here's perhaps the best example of the vaporized store. What you're looking at in this photograph is not a retail store. This is a subway station in Seoul, Korea. As you can see, the gentleman in the middle of the photo is about to step into the subway. He's going through the doors. Now, in Korea, they're a little bit smarter than the United States. They actually put glass panels in front of the tracks so passengers don't fall into the tracks the way they can in New York. So the retailer they named Home Plus thought about that, and they said, gee, we'd like to expand our number of outlets. Why don't we bring the store to where the people are? They noticed people are standing there looking at these glass panels while they're waiting for the train. So they took life-size photographs of the products and put them on the glass panels. And that young man in the foreground, well, he's making a purchase with his phone. And when he arrives at his destination, there'll be someone there to greet him with his shopping bags. This idea was so successful in South Korea that Tesco, the company that owns Home Plus, replicated it in the UK. And what you're looking at here is not a store in London. This is the Waterloo train station in central London. They wrapped the columns with life-size photographs of products. And again, you can see the woman in the photograph. She's actually making a purchase with her phone. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, where will it stop? Are we going to vaporize everything? Is this guy going to stand here all morning and tell us ideas about how we're vaporizing things? I have news for you. It won't stop. It won't stop. I'll stop, but this won't stop. This process is going to continue and continue and continue until every single thing in our industry and in our society that can be replaced by software will be. A couple of years ago, Phil Schiller of Apple stood on stage at the Worldwide Developers Conference and announced that there were 1.3 million apps in the Apple App Store. That was a pretty big number. That was 2 years ago. Today, that number stands at 2.6 million. And analysts tell us that by the end of the decade, there will be 5 million apps available for your smartphone. Now, they may be in a very different form. They may be in the form of a chatbot and a messaging app. They may be in the form of a voice command skill, like something you might encounter on an Amazon Echo. So even the notion of an app, downloading an app, that might become something that's rather different. But the point I want to make about this transition that we're going through is that every one of those apps, when there are 5 million apps, every one of those apps represents something that used to be sold in physical form. That is to say, every single app represents something that used to be made in a factory, typically in Asia, put into a box, shrink wrapped, put in a pallet, stuck on a ship, a container ship, taken to a port, transferred to a truck, taken to a distribution center, and then it would eventually find its way to a retail shelf near you. All of that is being replaced by software. That entire value chain, that entire supply chain is being replaced by software. These new apps don't require any of that. So all that stuff, the factory, the port, the ship, the truck, the warehouse, all of it is being replaced by software. And the main message I have for you today is that as goods become more information rich, they begin to shed the characteristics of physical products and they take on the dynamics of a digital service. I want to repeat that. It's very important for us as we think about the future of education, because education is perhaps the most information-rich product that you can consume. As goods become more information-rich, they shed the characteristics of physical products and they acquire the attributes of a digital service. Now, if I were to ask the people in this room, what do you think the most important product of the last 100 years is? I think you'd agree with me, it's the automobile. It's the automobile. Henry Ford's innovation of the assembly line didn't just make cars available for the workers. Of course, it famously did do that. It also transformed the way we make everything. So the automobile and the assembly line is really the beginning of the mass consumer society that we live in today. But that's not the only important part of the automobile. The automobile as product also changed the way our cities are shaped. In the old days, you used to be able to walk across a town like this one, in an afternoon. It wouldn't take you long to do. Today, towns like, I live in Los Angeles, they're 60 miles long. It's unthinkable that you could walk across Los Angeles. It's an impossible concept. That's a consequence of the car. And that's not all. The automobile also put us on the global petroleum economy. And today, half of all petroleum purchases involve automobiles or trucks. And that's not all. There's another big change. The car changed the way we eat. I'm not kidding. Think about it. There was never a time in the past when there was a guy in a restaurant flipping burgers hoping that someone in a horse and buggy would stop by. But today, that happens a million times a day. Right? So fast food is a consequence of the automobile. Now, until fairly recently, the idea in American society in particular was that as you became an adult, you would buy a car. And a car was kind of equated with adulthood, not just adulthood, but liberty. This idea of personal liberty, freedom, and so forth. And 100 years of car marketing has done that to us. It's kind of embedded that notion in our heads. But for a rising generation, particularly young people who live in cities like San Francisco, the car isn't looked at as freedom. It's looked at as a heavy burden. It's a hassle. It's expensive. If you live in San Francisco and you own a car, you have to pay for a place to park it. It's like having a second apartment. And you have to feed it with gasoline, you have to pay for insurance and so forth. And so the car is viewed as a burden. But until fairly recently, there was no alternative to owning a car, particularly in the western part of the United States. We don't really have great public transportation. And so a car was simply something you had to buy. But today, we have an alternative. Today, you can have software instead of ownership. And so you don't necessarily vaporize the car, but absolutely, you can get rid of ownership of a car. I'm referring to car sharing or ride sharing services like Uber. And of course, you're all familiar with it, but if you haven't used Uber in a while, it's a very simple app. Instead of trying to hail a taxi cab in the pouring rain, you simply touch an icon on your smartphone, and a few minutes later, a car shows up, and that car is just for you. And it's going to take you where you want to go. And if you've used Uber in another country, well, it's actually a remarkably good experience. Instead of hassling with a cab driver and trying to fumble out instructions in a foreign language and deal with foreign currency, you simply jump in the car. The driver knows where to take you. When you get to the destination, you jump out, no cash, no money changes hands, and the driver deals with the car and goes and finds another passenger. You carry on with your meeting or whatever you're going to. And so it's a really remarkably great service. And of course, it's such a good idea, it's been replicated all over the world. So Uber's hardly the only company doing this. In India, Ola is a giant force that competes with Uber. In China, Didi Haojing is a major force. Here in the United States, Lyft presents competition for Uber. And in Europe, there are literally dozens of services like BlaBlaCar that compete with Uber there as well. So the idea has been replicated around the world. But what's really interesting is until fairly recently, the auto manufacturers didn't take this seriously. The auto manufacturers looked at this and they said, well, that's disruptive for the taxi and limousine business, but it's not a threat to us. It's not a real issue to us. And the auto companies didn't really wake up until 2015 when they saw this. Uber raised money at a private valuation of $62 billion, which exceeded the public market valuation of Ford Motors and General Motors. And at that point, the auto industry said, wait, we got to take this stuff seriously. And they began to pivot, and they made a major investment, a series of major investments. Today, every auto company in the world has a major stake in a ride-sharing company or a car-hailing company, or in the case of Ford Motors, they actually bought a ride-sharing company. And so as you can see, this information economy is beginning to reshape some of the things we take for granted. And some of the principal artifacts of the 20th century are being reshaped by information technology. The way we understand them, the assumptions that we make about those products, those are shifting very, very quickly as well. Now, I want to continue with the Uber idea with one other notion that's very important for education as well, which is that the idea of labor, something that every person possesses and can bring to the marketplace, that's being transformed right now because we're using software as a substitute for labor. Uber's been very clear in their intention to replace human drivers. And last fall, in September of last year, they began testing a robot taxi service in Pittsburgh, and now they've expanded that to other cities. But what's most interesting is that Uber wasn't the first company to do this. I was in Singapore last fall when a company called Nutonomy, which is a spin-out from MIT, launched the very first robot taxi service. And that's not the only one as well. And they're testing the service now in Tokyo. It's rolling out in the UK and in about 20 other cities around the world. And so as you can see, this information technology isn't just about games and maps and music. It's actually transforming our understanding of the motor vehicle. And it's starting to transform the way we approach work, the way we think about what labor may be. These ideas are being challenged right now by this concept of vaporization. Now, robots in the car industry are nothing new. Robots have been around for 30 years in every car plant. So if you go inside a car factory, this is what you'll see. Very few human workers are in the body shop. But what is new is that the price of robots is dropping tremendously. This Baxter robot from Rethink Robotics costs about $22,000. That puts it in range of every small business. It doesn't replace a human worker. A human worker can train it. It actually frees that human worker to do more challenging tasks. We're starting to see robots all over. Of course, a major driving factor in the push for robotics is the US military. They want to keep soldiers out of harm's way, human soldiers. And so you'll see that in the future, they predict that by 2030, robots will be on the battlefield. We already have robots flying around the sky. And of course, for the last several years, for 2 decades or more, all the really serious scientific research done in space has been done by robots. This example is the SpaceX robotic spacecraft that's refueling the space station. But today, you can find robots in all kinds of situations around us. There are the SoftBank's Pepper robot is being introduced in retail shops as a kind of shopping assistant right now in the United States. In Tokyo, there's a robot hotel where 90% of the tasks in the hotel are done by robots. In Beijing and in San Francisco, there are robot restaurants. And in Berlin, this robot bartender will mix a drink to your specifications. But remember, robots are just a manifestation of software automation. So robots are a subset of automation. Automation is much broader, but it's invisible, it's intangible. Software automation is not something we can see. And it's often presented in the press as a scary thing, as it is here, this giant tornado that's wiping away desk-based jobs. It's always presented as a threat. So here we have the Financial Times, and it says that software automation is a threat to employment, a threat to jobs in the future. And most of the frenzy in the press on this topic of automation and the robot apocalypse that will take away all of our jobs and so forth, most of that stemmed from a research that was done at Oxford University and was released about 4 years ago. 2 researchers there did an analysis of jobs in the United States, and they found that half the jobs, 47% of the jobs, are highly repetitive and therefore susceptible to be replaced by robots. Now, that's a very important thing as we think about the future of education. We think, well, what are we training people to do in the future? If after decades and decades of de-skilling work, we've made it possible for half the jobs to be replaced by software automation, what kind of world are we preparing students for? It's certainly not a world of factories or factory-based jobs. But in fact, that's how our education system is set up. Sir Ken Robinson is the one who's pointed out that the public education system in the United States and the UK was principally designed to train future workers. So we had students taught in the one-room schoolhouse, but even today, taught to sit in orderly rows at desks so that they can sit in orderly rows in factories and sit in orderly rows in front of machines. And similarly, at public schools across the country, children are taught to stand in line. They're taught to stand in line so that they'll be ready to stand in line at the factory and perhaps more appropriately stand in line at the soup kitchen when the jobs are eliminated. And so in many ways, our education system today contains a mimetic echo of the past. It's got built into it assumptions that are very old. In fact, they predate the automobile, they predate mass manufacturing. I would argue that the education system that we have today is dominated by a 500-year-old concept, the book. You see, the book, as Marshall McLuhan explains, the book is the very first mass-produced product. It's the very first mass-produced information product. And that concept of division of labor was perfected in Venice in the early printing houses, where one person would be a typesetter, another person would be melting lead, and 2 other people there are working the press in that picture. And that's the idea that Henry Ford borrowed when he created the assembly line, that idea that you can use division of labor, get people specialized on a task, and you can create things at a much greater scale. Now, the printing press also made it possible for the modern concept of mass education to happen, the way we deliver education today. The picture on the left shows you a lecture. And the university lecture is a format that's over 1,000 years old. And that was because in those days, books were very scarce. And so someone could read to a group of people. It's a bit like the setup that we have right now in this room, right? Someone's presenting, everyone else is listening. But the idea that you can have a classroom full of students who could all have an exactly identical copy of the same manuscript, and they could all be on the exact same page, that is a byproduct of the printing press. That's a byproduct of the book. Now, what's very interesting is that you can see that the book then shaped the way the classroom looks. That photo on the right there is a good illustration of the way classrooms are set up today, the way we think about education. All of this is kind of derived from this notion of the book. But what's very odd to me is that when I visit universities, I notice that we set up our computer labs in the exact same setup, the exact same. And it's no surprise to me that no one's in these computer labs. Whenever you visit a school, you notice they're completely empty. Because when you look at what students are actually doing with computers in a lecture room, if you stand in the back of the lecture room, you notice they're looking at cat videos on YouTube during the lecture. I think it's time for us to rethink everything. I think we have to really sit down and have a fundamental rethink of what education is about. Of course, the question I would pose to you is, will the university be vaporized? I think you know where I'm going with this. You can probably predict my own feeling about it. What I do notice is that every time I've had a conversation with universities and faculty across the country, I've encountered a lot of resistance to this notion. There are a lot of professors I've spoken to who said, no, you'll never replace the on-campus experience. But then I also noticed that every major North American university now has a free version of their curriculum streaming on the World Wide Web. So it seems like a contradiction in terms. Now you might wonder, why would a private college that charges $60,000 a year tuition offer their product for free on the internet? Seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? The answer to that question is that they have no choice. Because venture-funded startup companies like Udacity and Udemy and Coursera are coming along, and they have a mission to scale their educational programs to serve billions of students, because they understand that in this coming information economy, we need to train many, many more people than the physical universities can accommodate. The student they're going after will never set foot on campus at Harvard or MIT. They're trying to reach a global audience. They're trying to scale up to them. And so there's tremendous pressure being introduced by these MOOCs. The interface, the way people access these schools, is typically going to be through a mobile device. And that mobile device is important. As educators, we have to be aware that the mobile phone has transformed our students. It's changed their expectations in some dramatic and very profound ways. For a generation that grew up with ubiquitous broadband access to mobile devices, the letters www don't stand for World Wide Web. They stand for whatever, wherever, whenever. And that's their expectation. They expect that they should be able to command media on their terms. They are not the subject of mass media. They're the driver of it. They're the commander of it. They control the consumption of their media. They control their media habits. They get to experience what they want, when they want it, on their own terms. And we need to cater to that. We need to respond to that, because that expectation is baked in. When I work with major media companies, I try to encourage them to make room for the 3.5 billion people that are already using the internet. By the time students graduate from this school, from the Johnny Carson School, there'll be 5 billion people using the internet. And I would encourage students to bake that into their assumptions about what media and arts will be. When we think about people who are audiences of digital media, we must think of them as a kind of activated audience. And as a creator of digital media, you cast your audience the same way you cast actors into roles. You cast your audience. You give them something to do, not just to sit there and watch. You give them something to do. So if it's a game, if there's a game-based marketing component to your product, well, then of course they're going to be players and participants. But if it's a content experience, then your audience can be commenters, or they can be curators, or they can be discussion moderators. And of course, with online marketing and social media, they can become influencers and contributors as well. With the advent of crowdfunding and crowdsourced financing, there are other roles for the audience. They can now become participants by investing in a program, investing in a new product, or even investing in a company. Of course, then they become evangelists for it. They have a stake in the success, so they're going to try to encourage other people to experience it. So I want us to think beyond the book. I want us to think in these next 2 days, as we start to think about the future curriculum for this school. I want us to try to shed the assumptions that have been baked in about what education is, how it's presented, and how it should be consumed, and start to understand the dynamics of the living network. Let me just briefly go through this one boring slide with you, because I think this is the important takeaway for this part. So when we think about education beyond Gutenberg and moving past that Gutenberg legacy, the Gutenberg legacy gives us static content that's presented in fixed media. It doesn't change when you use it. It's a one-way presentation to a passive audience. And it's always involving a physical place, a classroom and a campus. But with digital media, we can move away from that to something rather new. The living network, the interactive network, allows us to present a dynamic knowledge base that responds and grows and changes and is shaped by the users themselves. And it can be presented in interactive, responsive media that we participate in, so that passive audience shifts and become an active co-creator in the experience. And that's a cool vision for a school of the future, I think. My vision is that school education can be presented at any time, at any place, on any screen, on any device, to any student in the world. And that program won't be subject to the rules of mass media. It'll be personalized and responsive. It'll conform to the expectations and the use habits of that audience. And we think then thereby we may be able to cultivate a habit of lifelong learning. This idea that you go to school for 4 years and you kind of fill up the gas tank of knowledge and now you're going to go embark on a 40-year career, that idea is a thing of the past. All of us now are tasked with the responsibility to think and grow and continue to learn. We want to teach our students that habit, that lifelong learning habit. Now, with respect to the emerging digital arts or emerging media arts, I want to end with a few thoughts about what the students at this school, what subject matter they might focus on. I've presented you with a number of ideas that are very challenging and very disturbing. And for a lot of people today, right now, that creates tension, tremendous tension, some source of anxiety. And I think that dynamic transformation may be at the heart of what these students will focus on at the Johnny Carson School. They'll focus on platforms. They'll focus on the future of platforms, and they'll engage in a debate about whether those platforms should be open or closed. And of course, connected to those platforms is this notion of control. I think control is going to become a very important topic when people design interactive media experiences and digital arts. And control is really a debate about whether the future of our digital network should be decentralized. That was the original promise of Web 1.0, a decentralized content system. But today, Web 2.0 has led us to this highly consolidated world, highly centralized knowledge bases, where data assets are hoarded by gigantic companies. David Weinberger had a great phrase in the early days of the web. He called it small pieces loosely joined. But I would describe today's web as large chunks tightly integrated. And so we've really had a tremendous swing from one direction to the other. Perhaps Web 3.0 will go back in the direction of decentralization, and perhaps the students at this school will play a role in articulating that. I believe there's going to be a debate, a dynamic tension around the concept of identity. In particular, what of my identity do I own? And what part of my identity is owned by somebody else as a data asset in their database? And finally, one other thought, very timely for the moment that we're in. This quest for truth. The notion of truth, the notion that there can be a truth, has become something that's challenged, that's pulled into question right now, as we're subject to so much fake news and fake allegations of fake news and this kind of counterclaiming that's going on right now. I think our students in the future will have to contend with the notion of despair that several generations are experiencing right now, as our shared notion of consensus reality collapses and is under assault. And the idea that you can invent your own truth or fabricate your own truth and live by that, that's a novel, new idea. And I hope that the students at this school will explore that idea as well. And so it's with those thoughts that I introduce you to this concept of thinking about the future of education. I'm Robert Tercek, and I'm very, very excited to be here and to participate in this conversation with you today. Thank you.